Seeking Beauty by Donis Boy. Prologue. Desert. Hard, barren, unforgiving desert, as far as the eye could see. To her right, endless sand. To her left, endless sand. And in front of her only a long stretch of railroad track, disappearing off into distance. All of it standing out starkly against the huge expanse of cloudless sky, where the sun burned a dusky orange as it kissed the horizon. Sweat dripped down in absolute torrents, stinging her eyes, making her coat feel sticky and slimy. Every pump of the rail car's lever sent another shudder through her aching muscles and another stream of perspiration down her back. But at least the discomfort caused by all this unladylike sweating and grunting served to distract her from the constant, incessant babbling that buzzed in the air like so many horseflies. For just as the sweat came pouring down in endless rivers, so poured out endless words from her companion's mouth. She'd stopped listening long ago, of course, but she couldn't completely block them from her mind. All those words marched relentlessly forward, relentlessly onward. As the non-stop chatter battered her sanity, she tried to calm herself with daydreams about all the terrible vengeance she would reap upon a certain rainbow-maned Pegasus. Then, the babbling suddenly stopped. She closed her eyes and drank in the sudden silence. It was as sweet as a drink of cool, refreshing water would have been at the same moment. The quiet was not to be long-lived, however. Hey, Rarity. I just wanted to say thanks. For what? Her voice snapped out like a whip, much harsher than she'd meant it to sound. But that harshness was only met with a happy giggle. For catching me. They both lapsed back into silence. The only thing to be heard, as dusk descended upon them, was the rhythmic squeak of the rail car's wheels as they traveled along the tracks. You're welcome, Pinky. The words were so quiet, so gentle, they were almost lost to the wind. Almost, but not entirely. Chapter 1. It began with a simple business card. The Duchess of Hoofington had been taunting her all through the evening, going on at length about her fabulous new caterer, who was as yet a complete unknown in Canterlot's high society circles. All through the soup course, through the salad course and well into the course featuring the main entree, the Duchess had sung the praises of her caterer's many delectables. Cakes and pies and tarts and, apparently, dragon fire creme brulee. Even Fancy Pants, the most patient and tolerant of hosts, had shot the boastful mayor a few annoyed looks from his place at the head of the dinner table. But it wasn't until the dessert course that the Duchess finally moved in for the kill. You know, Lady Rarity, she began, with a smile as sharp as a dagger, I really should put you in touch with my caterer. I'm sure her work would be just the most perfect thing for your fashion show after parties. Is that so? Rarity's smile was every inch as sharp and as dangerous. Do tell, my dear Duchess. The Duchess, a pale green unicorn with a too thin face, tilted her head. I believe I have her business card somewhere or other. Oh, and while I'm looking for it, may I ask you something, Lady Rarity? A calculated pause, followed by another one of those awful smiles. I was hoping you might be able to create one of your stunning dresses for my daughter to wear at her upcoming cute señora, if you happen to be available to do so. I know how busy you get this time of the year. Aha. There it was. Rarity had been waiting for it because she knew, as surely as she knew that the Duchess of Hoofington was both an insufferable bore and an insufferable bore, that this would come down to a matter of quid pro quo. I'm sure I can make some time in my schedule, she replied in a light, breezy tone, and I would be delighted to design for your lovely daughter. Free of charge, too, of course. That went without saying. Almost everything went without saying among Canterlot's aristocracy, really, as directness was considered terribly uncouth. As refined and elegant as she already was when she first moved to Canterlot, Rarity had still been a bit surprised to learn that, here, nothing could ever be said but only implied. All of those years in Ponyville, surrounded by ponies such as Applejack and Rainbow Dash, who seemed to have had the filters between their brains and their mouths surgically removed at birth, had taken their toll on the unicorn's sensibilities. She'd grown too used to ponies actually meaning the things they said. She'd learned quickly, though. She'd had to. Still smiling, the Duchess of Hoofington took out a small white card and placed it on the fine linen of the table. She gently nudged the card towards Rarity with a dainty burst of magic. "If I do give you this, you must promise that you'll contact her. I don't give her information out to just anyone, you realize." Despite herself, Rarity felt a flush of pleasure. That she wasn't just anyone. It was silly, and it was wrong, but she felt it nonetheless. "I give you my word, Duchess," Rarity said in a solemn tone, as she used her own magic to pick up the business card, which she almost dropped, once she saw what was written upon it. Because on the front of the card, in swirly pink script, were the words, "Pinkie Pie, Esquire, DDS, PhD. Sugar Cube Corner, Proprietress Caterer, Party Planner, and Balloon Animal Artist." Mixing business with friendship was never a good idea. And the mere thought of deliberately and voluntarily bringing Pinkie Pie up to Canterlot was enough to cause Rarity to nearly break out in psychosomatic hives. But she had promised the Duchess, and one simply did not break promises to nobility. So it was that she was now pacing around the large room that housed her work studio, anxious and restless, all while trying not to imagine all the many different ways everything could go horribly, horribly wrong. Soon enough, however, she was interrupted by her assistant, a rather short and stout young unicorn stallion, who rushed into the room as though being chased by an entire pack of timber wolves. "I am so sorry, Lady Rarity," he gasped out, eyes wide with fear and contrition. "I tried to inform Lady Pinkie that I would announce her arrival, but she—" He was cut off as a familiar, high-pitched voice squealed, "Oh, my gosh. This place is so big." Rarity smiled almost despite herself as a blur of pink bounded into the room, and it was one of her seldom-seen genuine smiles. Turning to her assistant, she replied, "It's quite all right, Snips. You oughtn't blame yourself at all. But would you go prepare some tea for the both of us, please?" "Yes, m'lady." With a bow, the young unicorn stumbled his way out of the room, closing the door behind himself. Once he'd left, Rarity approached her newly arrived guest, who was facing away from her and poking at a clothes mannequin with a curious hoof. "Lady Pinkamena. It's so good to see you, darling." Pinkie Pie turned around with a grin. "Huh. Lady Pinkamena. You are so funny, Rarity. That is your title, you know." The unicorn sighed. This was a conversation that had been had many times, but still, she felt compelled to try again. She always felt compelled to try again. "Certainly you remember the ceremony at which Princess Celestia bestowed ladyships upon all of us? In honor of our, and I quote, in honor of our dedicated service to the nation as bearers of the elements of harmony." Somehow, Pinkie was now halfway across the studio, inspecting some bolts of fabric with intense interest. She called out over her shoulder, "Well, sure, I remember. The party we had after that was one of the bestest I'd ever thrown. But it's still really funny when you call me Lady Pinkamena." With a quiet sigh, Rarity decided to let the matter go. The truth was, none of her friends ever used their titles, with the occasional exception of Rainbow Dash, who was of the firm belief that having a title made her name 20% cooler. In fact, Applejack had nearly refused to receive her ladyship at all, and it was only the combined pleading of Rarity and Twilight that had swayed the stubborn farm pony. "I suppose you are right," the unicorn allowed, ever gracious. "Well, then, let me start by saying that it was kind of you to come on such short notice, Pinkie. Of course. I'll love my friends, and I'll love parties. How could I not come?" At the mention of friends, Rarity perked up. "Ah, yes, that reminds me. Before we settle down to business, perhaps you could join me for tea and share a bit about how everyone is doing back in Ponyville." She didn't actually have the time to do so, but then again, she never had the time. For anything, really. After only a few weeks of living in Canterlot, Rarity had learned that she'd have to make the time for the things that were truly important. For instance, she'd been in the middle of a big rush order for Sapphire Shores when the letter arrived inviting her to Rainbow Dash's big tryout for the Wonderbolts, which, naturally, had been scheduled for the very next day. She had stayed up through the entire night, working at a feverish pace, but still it hadn't been enough. By morning, she'd only completed half of the gowns that Sapphire had requested. It had been unfortunate, but there was only one thing that could be done. She had dashed off a quick letter to Miss Shores full of the most abject apologies, and then she had hopped the express train to Ponyville. She arrived just in time to join her other friends for the balloon ride that would take them all to Cloudsdale. And the very moment they'd landed in that grand city of the Pegasi, she'd found herself engulfed in a giant, crushing hug by an athletic Pegasus pony with a shaggy rainbow mane. "Thanks for coming on such short notice, Rare," Dash had whispered in her ear, her voice even huskier than usual. "I'm really glad you could make it." Rarity had laughed. "Don't be ridiculous, Rainbow. I wouldn't have missed this for the world." That had been 2 years ago. 2 years Dash had been a Wonderbolt, and 2 years Rarity had received not a single order from Sapphire's Shores. She regretted nothing. The afternoon tea shared by the two old friends was a much louder, more boisterous affair than the teas to which Rarity had grown accustomed. Pinkie guzzled cups of the beverage as quickly and as messily as she used to down mugs of cider at Applejack's farm, all the while talking at a near breakneck pace. And then Twilight got that look on her face. You know, the one where her eyes start twitching? And Fluttershy said we should probably all leave, but I wasn't so sure about that. I mean, if your friend is upset, shouldn't you stay there and help them? So I was trying to explain all that to Fluttershy, but then Applejack chomped down on my tail and started dragging me away. Rarity took a dainty sip of her own tea. Ever the eloquent diplomat, our Applejack, she murmured, fond amusement tinging her voice. "Aha!" agreed Pinkie enthusiastically, as she slurped more tea. "Oh, and then the library burned down. Again. But it's okay. Apple Bloom is fixing it back up, and it should be good as new soon." Finishing off yet another cup of tea, the Earth Pony sat back and grinned. "So, what's new with you?" It was a question that Rarity was often asked, though not usually with such informal phrasing, and never with the utter sincerity of that shown in Pinkie's voice. Rarity found it rather a nice change of pace, truth be told. "Not too terribly much, darling," she replied with a casual wave of her hoof. "It's been the same clients, the same dinner parties, the same plays and musicals for the last few months. Sweetie Belle was able to stay for a few days not too long ago, though, and that was quite the treat. Her tours keep her so busy lately." "I bet. I mean, she's only the bestest singer in all Equestria." Rarity found herself smiling again. "I must admit that I agree with that opinion, though Sweetie tells me I'm biased. But if an older sister can't show a bit of pride, who can?" "Oh, I so totally know what you mean," chirped Pinkie, nodding rapidly. "When my little sister broke open her first geode, I was so proud, I threw her a party right then and there." "You have a younger sister?" Rarity couldn't quite keep the note of surprise from her tone. "No, silly, I have 2 younger sisters. They both still live on the farm, though. They took over the rock farming from Mom and Dad a few years back." The unicorn took another sip of tea, while pondering over the various implications of this new bit of information. "Fascinating. I never knew you had sisters," she finally confessed. Pinkie grinned in reply. "There's a lot the ponies don't know about me. Twilight says I'm complicated." "I do believe our dear Twilight is quite correct in that assessment." Rarity chuckled dryly. "Though, she usually is, isn't she?" "Yepers. She's such a smarty pants." At the thought of Twilight, Rarity had to stifle a sigh. How long had it been since she'd last visited Ponyville and seen Twilight Sparkle and the others? 2 months? 3. She and Twilight corresponded regularly, of course. The studious unicorn did love writing and reading letters. But it wasn't as satisfying as when they'd lived just down the road from one another. Fluttershy also sent mail fairly often, but neither Applejack nor Rainbow Dash were much for written correspondence. For her own part, Pinkie sent care packages with little notes tacked inside, but the various cupcakes and brownies tended to smudge out all of the words she'd written down. They still loved her, and she still loved them. That hadn't changed a single iota through all the years. If anything, she'd come to love them more and more as the years passed by. But things simply weren't the same. Of course, that had been the point, back when she'd first planned her move. She'd long grown tired of Ponyville, with its humdrum everyday sights, its constrictions and its limitations. She'd longed for the bustling streets and towering buildings of the big city, for the glimmering opportunities Canterlot promised for her career, and she'd been blessed to have friends who urged her to go, even as they cried and hugged her close. Rarity glanced out the window of her boutique, out at those wide, bustling streets of Canterlot, where countless ponies dressed in the finest of clothing passed by. She usually adored pony watching, silently critiquing the various fashions that walked by her window, but at the present moment she couldn't seem to muster up any enthusiasm. The sigh she had been holding in finally slipped out. So lost in all these thoughts was the unicorn that she didn't notice that a silence had fallen over the little tea table until it was broken by an unusually soft, unusually serious voice. Are you happy, Rarity? Rarity turned to look at Pinkie Pie, and slowly she blinked as she attempted to clear the cobwebs from her mind. What? Why would you ask such a thing? She shook her head. Of course I'm happy. The other mare frowned. Are you sure? Pinkie, I am fine. I am better than fine. I'm a successful, sought-after designer in one of the most glamorous cities in Equestria. This is everything I ever wanted. Why wouldn't I be happy? I guess that's a good point, said Pinkie, still sounding the slightest bit doubtful. As long as you're extra super sure. I am. Quite sure. And she was happy. She had accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do, and what more was there than that? What greater happiness could there be than making your dreams come true? Now, as we have finished with tea, shall we begin discussing the preparations for tomorrow night? Not waiting for an answer, Rarity stood up and began heading across the room towards her work desk at a brisk trot. After a few moments she heard the clap of hooves behind her, as Pinkie finally followed. Chapter 2. Now, tell me, darling. What are the rules again? Aproned Pinkie Pie huffed and rolled her eyes. Rule numero uno. Don't leave the kitchen. Good, good. Rarity gave a clipped nod, before turning and running her eyes along the gleaming steel kitchen counters that held trays upon trays of delicate pastries. And rule number 2? Don't leave the kitchen. The icing on the cherry tarts was a touch crooked, but otherwise, everything was in excellent order. Rarity allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. And rule number 3. Check with you before I do anything. Such as? A beleaguered sigh. Such as leaving the kitchen. Correct. I'm very proud of you. Rarity finally turned back around to beam at her caterer. In reply, the other mare pouted. I'm not a little filly, Rarity. I've planned and catered a bunch of fancy pants parties, and I totally know what I'm doing. Oh, I know, darling, I know. Rarity reached out and patted her friend's shoulder in what she hoped was a placating manner. But this is a very important event, you must understand. All of the most important names in fashion will be here, Rorty Torty, Photo Finish, Fleur de Lis, on and on and on. And it's gonna go great. I Pinkie promise. Pinkie bounced over to the kitchen's entrance and peeked out at the banquet hall beyond the doors. Are you sure you don't need my help with the decorations, too? A spike of icy terror went through Rarity's heart at the mere thought of her beautiful and tastefully decorated hall done up in tacker paper streamers and garish balloons. Oh, no. I mean, Please don't feel as though you have to bother yourself with that. You have more than enough to handle here in the kitchen, after all. Pinky glanced over her shoulder with a deeply suspicious frown. For a long, tense moment, she stared right at Rarity, seemingly right through Rarity, before her entire face broke into a blinding smile. "Okie dokie locky," she chirped, bounding back over to the ovens. The fashionista let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in. "Well, as you have everything well in hoof here, I think I'll pop out into the main room to check on the ice sculptures and string quartet." But when she reached the kitchen door, she hesitated and bit her lip. "You do still remember the rules, don't you?" Pinkie Pie blew a raspberry at her. Right. Just checking." Everything went fine, at first. For the first 2 hours or so, everything went rather swimmingly, in fact. All of the ponies she'd been hoping would attend had shown up, and Fleur de Lis had even brought along Fancy Pants as her companion for the evening, and dear old Fancy Pants was always a sight for sore eyes. Even better, as she worked her way through the crowds, mingling and playing hostess, Rarity could overhear different groups of ponies discussing her winter fashion line with excited and complimentary words. Hoity-toity himself pronounced her designs simply divine. She'd also heard numerous high praises for the food at the reception, in particular the desserts, and Rarity silently promised herself that she would relay all of these compliments back to Pinkie as soon as the party was over. Then, she made the fatal mistake of mentally patting herself on the back for a job well done with the evening's festivities. The fates must have heard her thoughts and been angered, for no sooner had she congratulated herself did she hear a completely unfamiliar voice call out, "Lady Rarity! Oh, Lady Rarity!" Quickly slapping a smile on her face, Rarity turned around and saw 2 Pegasi fluttering towards her. The stallion was sleek and grey, with a dark mane, while the mare was a soft salmon color. Rarity had not the faintest clue who either of them were. "Lady Rarity," greeted the stallion, once he was in range. "I just wanted to personally thank you for inviting us to your little soiree. We've had the most delightful time." Rarity just kept smiling at the Pegasi as her mind raced, desperately trying to recall the names of the 2 ponies who stood before her and coming up completely empty. The female Pegasus gave her a penetrating look. "You do remember us, don't you?" "Why, of course. Of course I do, darling." The unicorn could feel a trickle of cold sweat snake its way down her back. "How could I ever forget?" "Hi, guys." Pinkie Pie had somehow materialized right by Rarity's side, as if by magic. She was no longer wearing her apron but now in an elegant dress, the same gown she'd worn to her very first grand galloping gala, actually. "Oh, look, Rarity. It's Sir Feathermane. And he's brought along his husband's favorite cousin, Lady Ginger Snaps." Sir Feathermane looked a bit confused as he turned to stare at the intruding pink pony. "I beg your pardon, madam, but I don't believe we've yet to make an acquaintance." "Oh, no, we haven't met yet, but I'm sure we're gonna be really great friends." Pinkie grinned hugely, then thrust out a full red hoof. "Hi. My name's Pinkie." "Sir Feathermane, Lady Ginger," Rarity quickly interrupted, nudging Pinkie to the side. "Please allow me to present to you Lady Pinkamena Diampi. She is a good, dear friend of mine from Ponyville." She turned slightly and nodded to Pinkie. "Lady Pinkamena, this is Sir Feathermane and Lady Ginger Snaps of Cloudsdale." It was a bit of a gamble, adding that they were from Cloudsdale, as Rarity still hadn't the foggiest notion just who these 2 ponies were. But the vast majority of the Pegasus aristocracy hailed from the particular metropolis, so she had decided it wasn't too risky a gamble. Fortunately, the smiles that graced the faces of both Lady Ginger and Sir Feathermane told Rarity that her shot in the dark had paid off. In addition, Feathermane had obviously taken note of Pinkie's title, as he was now gazing at the riotous pony with a bit more respect. "Indeed. It is a pleasure, Lady Pinkamena." Pinkie began shaking hoofs with both the Pegasi at the same time. "Nice to meet ya, Yes. Well. Lady Ginger, for her own part, seemed completely flustered. She subtly extracted her hoof from the earth pony's grasp. I'm charmed to meet you, as well, Lady Pinkamena. I am afraid we can't tarry too long, however. We really just wanted to thank Lady Rarity for a wonderful evening before we left for Cloudsdale. Of course, replied Rarity, as smooth as silk. I do hope you both have a safe journey home. And please give my regards to your wonderful husband, Sir Feathermane. After another round or 5 of pleasantries and goodbyes were exchanged, the 2 Pegasus headed out the door at last. The moment they'd left, Rarity whirled around to gape at Pinky with a combination of bafflement and awe. How in Equestria did you know who those ponies were? It's like I keep telling you girls, explained Pinky, her eyes laughing. I know every pony. Suddenly, Rarity felt a tad bit guilty about the little lecture she'd given in the kitchen earlier that day. But why? Why did you? Pinky smiled, but it wasn't one of her usual, face-splitting smiles. It was small and gentle, strangely intimate, almost secretive. Because I owed you one, Rarity. Utterly nonplussed by that answer, Rarity simply glanced back towards the front door of the banquet hall, through which the 2 Pegasi from Cloudsdale had just left, to give herself some time to compose her thoughts and try to process what had just occurred. She shook her head. Even after all these years, Pinkie Pie was still surprising her, still as unpredictable as always. It was oddly comforting, really. When Rarity turned back around, she saw that Pinkie now had a frown on her face. Pinkie? What's wrong, dear? You're not mad that I left the kitchen, are you? Goodness, no. Of course not. Why, you saved me from a terrible faux pas just now. How could I be mad about that? Rarity smiled warmly. No. I'm grateful, not angry. Thank you. The frown evaporated instantly, only to be replaced with a beaming smile. No problemo. Then Pinkie tilted her head and curiously sniffed at the air. Ooh, smells like the mini chocolate quiches are starting to burn. Gotta go. With bewildered amusement, Rarity watched as the pink pony bounded across the banquet hall, nimbly threading her way through the clusters of mingling ponies, and then disappeared behind the kitchen doors. She allowed her gaze to linger on the kitchen for a few additional moments, as she tried to work up the energy to dive back into the crowds and execute her hostessing duties to her usual standard of perfection. But just as she was about to do so, she was interrupted by a gentle cough that came from somewhere rather close by. Turning her head, the unicorn caught sight of Fancy Pants and Fleur de Lis, both standing just a few feet away and dressed to the nines. She smiled at the 2 unicorns, and it was almost as wide and as warm a smile as the one she'd just given Pinkie. Fancy Pants. Fleur de Lis. It's so good of you to attend, and I'm honored to have your presence. Rarity, darling. The stallion leaned forward and kissed her cheek. A splendid party, as always. Meanwhile, Fleur de Lis cut her eyes towards the kitchen, while a lightly teasing smile curled her lips. She's unique, isn't she? Him? Pinkie, you mean? Rarity giggled a bit. Well, I can't disagree with that. Pinkie is. She's in an entire class of her own, let's say. The other mare looked thoughtful for a moment or two before giving a small, approving nod. You make for quite the handsome couple, Lady Rarity. She's very beautiful. Rarity suddenly forgot anything and everything she might have been about to say. She may, in fact, have forgotten her own name, as well. She simply blinked at the 2 unicorns before her, completely mute. Indeed. Fancy Pants chuckled gaily. She's such a charming pony and a true breath of fresh air in a town as old as this one. I trust this means we'll be seeing her more often here in Canterlot. Finally, Rarity found her voice, as she spluttered in a distressingly unladylike fashion. But she isn't. We aren't. Oh, no need to try to hide it from us, interrupted Fancy Pants, with a sly wink. I assure you that Mum shall be the word with both of us regarding your new romance until you're ready to go public with it. And, my dear friend, if I may be so bold as to say, well done. You've chosen very wisely. I have. The stallion smiled. Most certainly. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Sir Feathermane and Lady Ginger just a few moments ago, and I was duly impressed with Lady Pinkamina's excellent sense of timing. Very gallant of her. Quite, agreed Fleur-de-Lis, with one of her Mona Lisa smiles. Slowly and thoughtfully, Rarity nodded her agreement. Yes. Yes, I suppose it was. She's very beautiful. Those words, so casual, so nonchalant, replayed over and over in Rarity's mind as she watched her old friend dance around the guest bedroom. It was one of two guest bedrooms that existed in Rarity's clean, spacious apartment, which sat directly above her fashion studio much as Rarity's old home had sat within the old Carousel boutique. But of course both Rarity's workspace and her personal space were much larger and much grander nowadays. Carousel boutique, in comparison, had been a complete hovel. The unicorn watched with a mixture of annoyance and affection as Pinkie Pie bounded around the room, opening up all of the chest drawers, each and every window, plus the closet. Fortunately, Rarity kept almost nothing in the guest rooms except towels and linens, so there wasn't too terribly much that Pinkie could disturb or put out of place. Then, after checking under the rug, for what, Rarity couldn't even begin to guess, the rambunctious pink mare flopped onto the bed and gave a happy little bounce. This is the squishiest, comfiest bed I've ever been on. Rarity smiled and felt a rush of warmth spring from somewhere deep in her chest, the way she always did when she'd managed to please a friend. I'm glad it's to your liking, dear. Giggling a bit, Pinkie returned Rarity's smile. Thanks again for letting me stay the night, Rarity. Think nothing of it. I wouldn't dream of having you make the trek all the way back to Ponyville at this time of night. Almost impossibly, Pinkie's smile grew even wider. You're always so nice, she said, her face open and almost painfully sincere. I'm really glad we're friends. She's very beautiful. It was odd. How one could fail to see something that was right there in front of one's very own eyes, until it was pointed out by someone else. Very odd indeed. Because Fleur-de-Lis had been right. Pinkie Pie was, in fact, not only beautiful but absolutely radiant. The Earth Pony sat on the guest bed with her thick mane hanging loose, almost wavy, around her shoulders, and her large eyes twinkled joyfully. Perhaps that was what made Pinkie beautiful. The perpetual joy, which couldn't help but shine through Pinkie's every pore, as Pinkie positively lived for the opportunity to share that joy with others. Rarity should have seen it. She shouldn't have needed for someone else to point it out to her. She was a fashion designer, after all, an artist whose media were all visual. Her entire life's purpose was about seeking beauty, appreciating beauty, creating beauty. She should have seen. She should have realized. But there was no sense in regretting what was past. Especially when one could be planning for the future, instead. If she could somehow tame Pinkie. Teach her. Mold her just a little. Well, Pinkie Pie could blossom into something really rather wonderful. She could even, perhaps, become a force to be reckoned with in the Canterlot social world. And she could also become a very valuable asset to Rarity, as well. But, of course, that would merely be a pleasant little bonus and not the main goal. Pinkie? The other mare had resumed bouncing on the bed but, at the sound of Rarity's voice, she immediately stopped and glanced over. What's up? I was wondering if you might be interested in staying in Canterlot for a few extra days. Rarity made sure to keep her tone even and calm, to not betray the slightest hint of excitement. There are a few more upcoming events on my social calendar, and I do so regret that you had to spend most of your time tonight in the kitchen. Pinky tilted her head, seemingly curious. You mean, I'd be a party guest? Not a caterer? Precisely. And it would all be my treat, of course. The preparations, the dresses, everything. You wouldn't have to spend a single bit. I dunno. Pinky frowned, very slightly, and her eyebrows knit together. These big fancy cantaloupe parties aren't really like Ponyville parties. They're not as much fun. Well, that's exactly why you should come, darling, to show every pony here how to have a proper good time. She paused and considered the implications of what she just said. Within the boundaries of tastefulness and decorum, of course. Still Pinky looked uncertain. The unicorn put on her most winning and persuasive smile. And I'm sure your lovely assistant at the bakery, Twist was her name, yes. I'm sure Miss Twist would love the opportunity to look after Sugar Cube Corner for a while longer and prove to you how responsible she is. And time for the coup de grace. After all, didn't you yourself relish the chance to prove your responsibility back when the bakery was still run by Mr. and Mrs. Cake? Biting her lip, Pinkie Pie appeared to be thinking over the matter very carefully, very deliberately. Then her face broke into one of her trademarked, blinding grins. Okie dokie locky. Rarity couldn't resist the urge to clap her hooves together in glee, much as she used to as a filly on Hearth's warming morning. Oh, excellent. We'll have such a good time, darling. I can hardly wait. Me neither. After exchanging good nights, Rarity trotted off towards her own bedroom with a light step and happy heart. She thought over all of her newly hatched plans and schemes as she prepared for bed, brushing out her mane, applying her nightly face mask, filing her hooves. There was a lot to be done in the morning, if she was to have Pinkie prepared enough to serve as her escort to tomorrow evening's art museum reception. She'd have to ask Snips to clear her calendar for the entire day, most likely, but one had to do what one had to do. With a contented sigh, Rarity slipped under the silky sheets of her bed. Losing a day's worth of work wasn't ideal, but it wasn't the end of the world by any means. And if the potential Pinkie had shown earlier tonight came to even partial fruition, the lost day of work would be nothing compared to what Rarity, and Pinkie herself, would gain in exchange. She drifted into the warm embrace of sleep with one final, lazy, hazy thought: she really is quite beautiful. Chapter 3. The voice was terribly loud and painfully high-pitched, and it came from somewhere rather too close to her left ear. The sounds were muddled at first but, gradually, they grew sharper and more distinct. Eventually, Rarity could make out actual whole words. Rarity, wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Rarity let out a groan and rolled over in bed. She didn't know what time it was, exactly, but she was fairly certain that, whatever time it might be, it was much, much too early. Come on, Rarity. We're gonna miss it if we don't hurry. Without lifting her head from her pillow, Rarity waved a hoof in the general direction of the disturbance. Go away, she mumbled. Go play in your own room, Sweetie Belle. The voice giggled in response. My name's not Sweetie, you silly filly. It's Pinkie Pie. Finally lifting her head, Rarity took off her sleep mask and cracked open an eye. A blindingly white smile and a pair of huge blue eyes filled up her entire field of vision. Oh, yes, yes, of course. Good morning, Pinkie. Pinkie leaned back a little and bounced impatiently on her hooves. So, can we go now? Go? Rarity tried to fight off a yawn but promptly lost the battle. Go where, darling? To see the surprise. Oh, it's the bestest surprise ever, and you'll be really, really glad you came to see. I promise. Cross my heart and hope to. All right. All right. Rarity sighed. She knew all too well, from years of experience, that giving in was her only true option at this point. Just give me a moment to make myself presentable, and then we'll go see your surprise. Rarity completed her morning routine in a fraction of the time it usually took, prodded along mercilessly by an over-enthusiastic Pinkie Pie. Soon enough she was following her friend up to the roof of the building that housed both Rarity's work studio and her apartment. The early morning air was chilly on the roof, and Rarity found herself walking as close as possible to Pinkie in a mostly unsuccessful attempt to keep warm. Once they'd reached the edge of the roof, Pinkie pointed off to a spot in the far distance, miles and miles away. Just visible above the horizon was a strange, multi-looped, zigzagging rainbow. "You woke me up at the crack of dawn and dragged me all the way up here just for a rainbow?" Rarity couldn't quite keep the edge of annoyance out of her voice. Rainbows weren't entirely common, it was true, but they also weren't entirely rare. And they absolutely weren't worth the price of losing precious beauty sleep. In reply, Pinkie rolled her eyes, but her tone remained good-natured and bubbly as she explained, "Not just any rainbow. One of Rainbow Dash's rainbows." Pinkie smiled. "And it's coming from the direction of Ponyville, which means she must be in town visiting, even though she didn't tell us she was gonna be coming to visit. She's such a sneaky pony sometimes, that Dashy." The unicorn scoffed in disbelief. "How could you possibly know that Rainbow Dashy is the one who created that rainbow?" Pinkie turned and gave Rarity a look that suggested the pink pony thought her friend had perhaps a few screws loose. It was rather a surreal moment. "Don't be silly, Rarity. Dashy's rainbows always have those extra loops, see?" She gestured towards one of the rainbow's many twists and curls. "It's cool she likes doing tricks when she's making them. No pony makes rainbows like Rainbow Dash." Now that Rarity thought about it, Pinkie was right. Dash's rainbows always did have that extra flair, those extra loops, didn't they? Rarity couldn't help but wonder just when exactly Pinkie Pie had noticed this. Actually, she wondered at all of these little things that Pinkie noticed about other ponies. And the unicorn abruptly wondered, with a touch of trepidation, as to what Pinkie might have noticed about her. "Isn't it so pretty?" asked Pinkie, her words soft and reverent. "Whenever I see a rainbow, especially one of Dashy's, I always think about how rainbows taught me how to smile. And then I feel happy deep down in my tummy, like I did the day back on the rock farm." Rarity nodded but said nothing. The cold outdoor air had her feeling a bit more awake, and now that she couldn't help but notice how the soft, muted rays of the newly risen sun made for a stunning backdrop and contrasted the hard, bright lines that comprised Dash's rainbow. It was breathtaking, really. The part of Rarity's mind that never stopped thinking about fashion started wondering if she could recreate this ambience, this beauty and its attendant feelings, in a dress. Perhaps a pastel chiffon laid over a more brightly colored and sturdier fabric. But her musings were interrupted when a quiet little sigh escaped her companion. Sometimes I get a teensy bit worried, though," the Earth Pony said. She sounded almost mournful. "That rainbows are too, frivolous. Or simple-minded. And I shouldn't like them as much as I do." Rarity drew in her breath and wondered how best to respond. That had always been one of Pinkie's problems. As quick as the pink pony was to forgive, she never, ever forgot. "Rarity? Do you think they're frivolous?" There was a plaintive note in Pinkie's voice, something yearning, almost childlike, and the unicorn felt a pang in her chest. "No," Rarity replied gently. "No, Pinkie, I think they're absolutely beautiful." There was a silence, and then Rarity felt something warm and soft press up against her. She glanced over to see Pinkie Pie nuzzling against her and beaming. "I knew you'd like the surprise." The building was huge, all polished stone and sparkling glass, rising up to touch the sky with all the majesty of one of the palace's spies. It was one of Rarity's absolute most favorite buildings in Canterlot. Even though its size and modernity made the building, as stunning as it was, feel a bit out of place in this very old city, Rarity adored the Museum of Contemporary Art and Culture. "Wow," murmured Pinkie Pie. Rarity turned to gaze at her date for the evening, and she couldn't help but smile. Pinky was staring at the museum with wide open eyes, her entire face alight with wonder and the purest kind of pleasure. Rarity felt a burst of happiness at seeing Pinky appreciate the building's architecture as much as she herself did. Impressive, no? Rarity asked, with a high, tinkling laugh. And just wait until you see the interior, darling. After another moment or two of gaping, Pinky finally dragged her eyes away from the museum and looked over at the unicorn with a redder smile. Still smiling herself, Rarity took an opportunity to give Pinky an appraising once-over. She had dressed Pinky in one of her very own gowns, a satiny affair in deep crimson, and she had personally applied Pinky's make-up, which was subtle but made the mare's cheeks glow even pinker than they usually did. She'd also taken Pinky to one of the most exclusive salons in Canterlot, much to the salon owner's eventual horror and everlasting trauma. But the results had been worth it. Pinky's mane had been wrestled into something more orderly than its usual state, an upswept style similar to the one she'd worn to their very first grand galloping gala. Right here, right now, the excitable baker and party planner actually looked the part of a pony who was named Lady Pinkamena Diampi. In fact, Pinky looked downright breathtaking. Rarity felt a burst of pride in what she'd accomplished in just one little day. Rarity. Pinkie Pie was fidgeting nervously under the unicorn's uncompromising gaze. Is something wrong? Do I look okay? Oh gosh, I didn't get my mane messed up already, did I? Rarity reached out with a hoof and smoothed it along Pinkie's shoulder in a reassuring way. No, darling, you have done an admirable job in keeping your hair neat and tidy thus far. Oh, yay. Pinkie clapped her hooves together as she cheered. Pinkie. Your manicure. The earth pony flinched. Oops. Sorry. It's quite alright, dear. Now, do you remember all of our lessons in etiquette from this morning? Pinkie stuck out her tongue thoughtfully as she started counting off on her hooves. I think so. Let's see. Don't hug any pony. If there's a chocolate fountain, don't stick my whole head in the chocolate fountain. Don't dance, no matter how great the music is. She glanced up. Are you sure about the no dancing part? Darling, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I was afraid you were gonna say that. She sighed gustily before she resumed her pondering. What else, what else? That's all of the stuff you taught me, I think. Rarity felt her lips twitch, trying to smile, but she forced her facial muscles into a stern expression. No, I'm afraid you've forgotten something. Oh, no. What? What did I forget? Why, the most important thing of all. Rarity's smile finally broke through. Don't forget to enjoy yourself tonight. Pinkie grinned at her with those wide, blue eyes of hers. With an exaggerated bow, Pinkie Pie suddenly took one of Rarity's front hooves between her own and lifted it to her lips. Then she pressed a light, gentle kiss to the unicorn's hoof before letting go. My dear Lady Rarity, she said, affecting a ridiculously awful upper crust accent, shall I escort you inside to these most promising and, wondrous festivities? Rarity couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. Very gallant of you, my dear Lady Pinkamena. And yes, let's go in. After all, we are just in time to arrive fashionably late. The large and ornate lobby of the museum teemed with ponies mingling, drinking, eating, and laughing their glittering, fake laughs. In the far corner stood two mares, young but no longer fillies, gorgeously attired, almost painfully beautiful, and the subject of many discreet longing glances. But neither pony noticed any of the looks being directed their way, as they were too busy whispering furiously to one another. And the dark blue stallion over there? That's Mr. Wrought Iron. He's from Philadelphia. I met him the last time I was there at a bakery convention. He owns a bunch of steel factories. Rarity gave a slight nod. The name sounded vaguely familiar, once she'd heard it. And that unicorn there by the hors d'oeuvres table. The one in the forest green dress? That's Lady Lovelace. She's a baron. A Barton. You don't mean a baronetess, do you, darling? Yeah. That. Pinkie Pie nodded cheerfully. She's originally from Nottingham, but she moved to Canterlot a few years ago. The earth Pony's eyes lit up, and she bounced up and down a few times. Ooh, ooh. And if you go over to talk to her, you should totally tell her to have a happy birthday tomorrow, 'cause tomorrow is her birthday. With a small, thoughtful frown, Rarity murmured to herself, Lady Lovelace, Baronetess, birthday tomorrow. Right, got it. Then, before the unicorn could ask after any of the other reception attendees, Pinkie began shuddering and shaking uncontrollably. A few nearby ponies glanced over with anxious expressions, and Rarity herself felt a sickening jolt of worry before she realized Pinkie's pinky sense. At last the shuddering stopped and, after a moment of appearing dazed, Pinkie shook her head and straightened her shoulders. She wore a determined look on her face. Sorry, Rarity, but I gotta go handle a smile emergency. Be back in a jiffy. And before Rarity could even formulate a question as to just what constituted a smile emergency, the pink mare had bounded off and disappeared into the surrounding throngs of reception attendees. Rarity briefly entertained the notion of following after Pinkie but decided against it. She doubted she'd be able to convince Pinkie to call off whatever mission she had just embarked upon, even if she was somehow able to catch up to the lightning-fast Earth Pony in the first place. She settled for sighing, deeply and dramatically, instead. It seemed she sighed more than usual whenever Pinkie was around, now that she thought about it. Lady Rarity? Is that you? The unicorn turned her head, just in time to see the Duchess of Hoofington approaching. The Duchess looked as thin and as pale as ever, while wearing an overly ornate gown of the most ill-advised fabrics and colors. With more than a hint of smugness, Rarity thought to herself that money could buy many things, but it couldn't buy good taste. Ah, good evening, Duchess. Rarity quickly put on one of her prefabricated smiles. It's a pleasure to see you this evening. And you, as well, replied the Duchess, in a sickly sweet voice. I trust you've already taken a peek at the new exhibit? All black paintings, the entire canvas just coated entirely in black paint. It's very avant-garde. Rarity was sure it was very something, but she kept the thought to herself. Instead, she simply nodded politely. Of course, the Duchess continued on, adopting a disdainful tone. They say the artist is mad as a hatter. Depression, you know. That's why he paints all in black. What was his name again? Rolling River? Rolling Rock? Rolling Stone, I believe it was. Yes, yes. Rolling Stone. That's right. The pale green unicorn laughed a bit. It sounded very much like braying. But that's quite enough about him. Tell me, Lady Rarity, surely a mare as lovely as you hasn't come to this little event without a proper escort. Rarity perked up a bit. There was a chance to brag a bit, and she did always like taking advantage of these little opportunities. Not at all, Duchess. My companion for the evening is the Lady Pinkie Diane Pie, who asked that I give you her regards, by the by, but I'm afraid Lady Pinkie had to step away for a few moments. Ah. I see. The Duchess smiled tightly. If I may, I'd like to offer a word of advice. From one friend to another. A highly unpleasant feeling churned in Rarity's stomach. Of course. I'd be honored to hear any wisdom you might have to impart. Ponies of our station do not consort with hired help. It's simply not done. I do understand that you're rather new to. Surely you don't refer to Lady Pinkie? Rarity interrupted, her voice icy and her eyes dark with a silent warning. The Duchess paused. When she spoke again, her voice was low and conspiratorial. Come now, Lady Rarity. We both know that the ladyships given to your little Ponyville friends were utterly undeserved and that you were the only one truly worthy of being made a lady." Rarity drew in a sharp breath and felt her magic suddenly begin flooding her horn. As of yet she wasn't sure just what exactly she was going to do with her magic, but she suspected that it was likely to be swift and painful. The Duchess of Hoofington eyes went wide in surprise, and then, "Attention, every pony." Immediately all of Rarity's anger drained away, along with her build-up of magic, only to be replaced with cold dread. She knew the voice that had just bellowed from the second floor of the museum. She knew that voice all too very well. Along with every other pony in the museum lobby, she slowly turned to gaze up at the source of the sudden interruption. Pinkie Pie stood right there at the second floor balcony, perched atop the balcony railing while beaming down at the entire lobby. Next to her stood a smallish male earth pony with a dark green coat and deep purple mane. He looked more than a bit nervous. Smart boy, thought Rarity. She knew that she should go after Pinkie to put a stop to whatever this was. But the numb shock caused by the entire situation left her rooted to the floor, motionless and mute. Pinkie gestured with a forward hoof as she continued yelling down to the gathered ponies. "Hi. This is my new friend, Rolling Stone. Most of you probably know him already, 'cause he painted all the neat paintings that are hanging up on all the walls here." She glanced over to the stallion and gave him a quick hug. "And he did a super great job, too. Didn't he, folks?" Rarity could hear some quiet murmuring go through the crowd. A few ponies were asking just who that crazy pink mare was, while a few others were suggesting that someone go fetch security. For the next part of her speech, Pinkie put on an almost comically serious face. But even though he's painted lots of neato paintings, that hasn't made him happy. In fact, he's been really, really sad. "Go on and tell Rowley." Rolling Stone waved awkwardly to the crowd below. Well, Lady Pinkie Minu and I were." "Oh, silly, I told you that you can just call me Pinkie." Right. Pinkie and I were talking, and she said a whole lot of things that made a lot of sense to me. About not doing things unless you wanted to do them. And about loving what you do decide to do." Oh, Rarity did not like where this was going. Not in the least. She suddenly wished she had had the chance to drop by the drinks table earlier in the reception to have a glass of wine or two. Or 3. Or 10. Meanwhile, the flustered artist was glancing over at Pinkie Pie, who just nodded for him to continue. Raising his voice a bit, he said, "So I'm not going to paint for galleries and museums anymore. I've always hated that paintings get hidden away in dusty old buildings and deny the light of day, so I'm going to go back to my first love. My true love." His entire face broke into a huge, goofy grin. "I'm going to go back to painting barns." The entire lobby of ponies gasped in perfect unison. For her own part, Rarity just closed her eyes and sighed yet another quiet, tired little sigh.